Back in the day, shunting trucks was a dangerous job. Running alongside wagons, hooking chains and checking brakes was tiring work, but in bigger yards it was made much worse as shunters would have to walk miles just to get from one end to the other. To make life easier for shunters, however, the Great Western Railway decided that what they needed to do was give their shunters a wagon of their own. Before Britain's railways moved goods using shipping containers, freight would be loaded into individual trucks or vans which would need to be organised into trains heading to their respective destinations. Hump yards allowed for wagons to be organised fairly quickly and efficiently, but as the trucks didn't have any kind of automatic brakes, workers were required to run alongside and apply the brakes manually to stop them from running away or from damaging other wagons by running into them too hard. They also had to couple together the wagons too once they were in place, all of this requiring them to carry around shunting poles, brake sticks and various other tools, all while running around the yard. Smaller locomotives were also used around the yard to move trucks to their appropriate sidings, which meant shunters often spent the day following engines around, coupling and uncoupling wagons to them. Rather than walk, to save their feet, shunters would often get about the yard by hanging on to moving trucks or even hanging off of the locomotives shunting them. The problem was the trucks weren't designed to be ridden, and so it was very easy for shunters to lose their footing, fall off and injure themselves. Drivers and firemen also weren't keen on letting shunters ride in their cabs either, as most shunting engines had very small footplates, leaving little room for a third passenger, meaning shunters either had to risk injuring themselves hanging off an engine or wagon, or suck it up and walk from one end of the yard to the other every time a wagon needed coupling. Seeing how their shunters needed a better way of carrying their tools and getting about, the Great Western Railway came up with a solution. Give the shunters their own wagon. Rather than bother the engine crew or hang off of wagons dangerously, they designed a special truck that would be coupled to the shunting engine as it worked. These trucks had footboards and rails for shunters to safely hang onto, as well as a toolbox fitted in the middle so shunters didn't have to constantly carry around their tools themselves. They also had manual brakes that the shunter could apply themselves, with later designs having vacuum braking equipment fitted too, giving engine drivers a little more stopping power while moving heavier loads. The toolbox came with the added benefit of not just carrying shunting tools, but also chocks to stop trucks from rolling away, as well as ramps, lugs and other equipment needed to re-rail wagons, minor derailments being something that was quite common in shunting yards. The first of the shunting wagons built by the Great Western Railway appeared in 1895, with 143 in use across the country by 1904. An additional 34 had been built by 1913, and another 119 were added to the fleet by the time the railways were nationalised in 1948, with British Railways building an extra 3 of their own. The amount of shunting trucks in each yard varied, with the average being 1 truck per shunting engine in service. Given their small size and limited versatility, it was rare these trucks ever left the yards they were allocated to. Other railways besides the Great Western built their own shunting wagons, such as the LMS and Southern Railways, but these were often made out of old wagons or modified tenders for use in specific yards, unlike the purpose-built GWR ones. Despite their utility, their relatively small size and light weight did make them troublesome to work with. Drivers had to be mindful of the extra length the truck added to the engine while shunting, and their light weight also meant that they were fairly easy to derail too. On top of all that, they weren't exactly the most safe way for shunters to get around either. Don't get me wrong, they were far safer than hanging off of random trucks, but at the end of the day, shunters were still standing on the side of a moving wagon. All it'd take would be a sudden jerk from the engine or slipping on a wet, muddy rail for the shunter to fall and hurt themselves. Regardless of these shortcomings, however, their utility and convenience more than made up for it. The shunting trucks continued to be used on the western region of British Railways for many years after the railways were nationalised, with some diesels even using them, but eventually their usefulness came to an end. Many of the new Class 08 shunting diesels built by BR were fitted with steps and a rail near their front, which allowed shunters to ride on the engine as opposed to a wagon. While they didn't have the same convenient storage as a shunting truck, most shunters were used to not having shunting trucks anyway, so the lack of anywhere to keep re-railing tools and spare equipment wasn't much of a bother outside of Great Western Territory. Eventually, the switch over from individual wagons to shipping containers completely changed how shunting was done, and as such, shunting trucks were no longer needed. A handful, however, have been preserved and are on display at various heritage railways all across the country. Working on the railways was a hard job for everyone involved, but few jobs may have been as hard or as dangerous as the work of shunters. So the fact that the Great Western Railway went out of their way to make their lives so much easier must have certainly been a blessing. And I suppose, when you spend all day organising other people's trucks, it must be nice to have a truck of your own, eh? Imagine, it's 1894 in England. You're on your way to work on the local commuter's train when you hear a clanging sound at the front of your coach. You poke your head out the window and see the rest of the train pulling away from you as your coach seems to have broken away from the others in front of you. Most of you would likely either try to call the guard or flat out wet yourself in fear because you're in a lone coach drifting down a main line. While it's fair to say you'd be shook, it was actually a very common occurrence for coaches at the end of passenger trains to detach, but not by accident. As railway companies were starting to compete with each other, focus was moved to speeding up passenger trains. The issue faced was that some expresses and other services had to stop at stations on the way, making the trip longer for passengers that just wanted to go to the end of the line. A prime example would be if people wanted to catch a train going from station A to station B, but most passengers on the train wanted to get off at station C at the end of the line. How can you make the service faster for people going to station C while still helping the people going to station B? I would make you guess, but I feel I've already given the answer away. The answer is the slip coach, or by slipping a coach. The idea is simple. Say 40 people want to stop at station B, but you have a whole train of 190 other people who just want to go to station C. Why not put all 40 people for station B in a couple of coaches, put them at the back of the train, and as the train is about to pass through station B, disconnect it. From there, a guard aboard can brake the coach to a stop either in the station or on the line where a smaller engine would shunt it to the platform. Passengers could then get off at station B without holding up everyone else. And if station B connected to a branch line, the coach would be connected to the branch line train and taken away with them. Should people then want to go from station B to station C, they would board the slip coach and it would be attached to the next train stopping at station B, and from there, taken to station C. It wasn't a very common practice, but it was frequently used on the railways that ran slip coach services, as it sped up passenger trains while also providing services to stations that otherwise would have been skipped to save time. The technique wasn't 100% perfect, however. Each coach required their own guard, meaning the railway had to hire more manpower. The coaches were somewhat more expensive to run, meaning ticket prices for slip coach services were higher than the average train ticket, and because they were separate from the rest of the train, passengers were stuck in the coach. So if you wanted something from the refreshment trolley or needed the toilet, you were fresh out of luck. There was also a lot of skill required in disconnecting the slip coach at the right time and braking it enough to stop it in the right place, so the guards in charge of the coaches needed extra training. The technique was used in the UK as well as Ireland, France, the Netherlands, the US, and many other railways around the world. In the UK at least, there have only been a few accidents regarding slip coaches that I have found, with the only fatal accident being in 1879, where a railway worker was walking along the track before stepping out of the way of a passing express, only to step back into the track and be ran down by several slipped coaches quietly following behind the train. Despite this, slip coaches were used in the UK from around the 1850s all the way up until the 1940s. Afterwards, railway companies didn't see the value in using them and the practice died off, with only the Great Western region of British Rail running a few slip coach services until 1960. Since then, slip coaches were replaced by dividing trains, where a long train stops at a station and disconnects several carriages that are then attached to another train and taken to their destination. A similar principle to slipping coaches, but without the need to disconnect the carriage while it's still moving. Nowadays, thanks to multiple unit trains having high acceleration, most trains can just stop at any station along the line without losing too much time on on a run. On top of that, it's just much easier for passengers to change trains rather than having to shunt the coaches if they want to travel to a branch line. While the practice seems dangerous, detaching a coach from a moving train and hoping the signalman is paying attention, it was a very simple solution to a very broad problem. Just another example of a simple idea going a long way. Or at least as far as the next station. Most passenger trains nowadays have a locomotive at each end, with most of the wheels on the carriages also being powered. This is so that when a train pulls into a station, the driver can just get out of the cab and climb into the cab at the other end so the train can pull out of the station without needing another engine to shunt the coaches, or have to waste time running the locomotive around to the other end of the train like they did in the days of steam and single diesel units. But what if I told you one of the first modern examples of a double-ended, non-electric train came about in 1904? Something similar to a modern double-ended passenger train was achieved by using push-pull trains back in the days of steam, where instead of the locomotive having to circle round to the front of the train at the end of the line, the locomotive would be positioned in the middle of the train, pulling one coach and pushing the other. This meant that the driver and fireman didn't need to waste time shunting the engine when they arrived at the end of the line. Sometimes engines would just stay at one end of the train, pulling one way and pushing another, and while both techniques saved time, they weren't flawless. The reason engines go at the front of a train is so that it's easier for the driver to see where he's going, so there's no problem when the engine is pulling the train, but when the engine is pushing the train, the driver is going to have difficulties seeing ahead of the coaches in front of them. The Great Western Railway, living up to their name, found a solution to this. Introducing the Great Western Auto Coach. First built in 1904, the idea was simple: have the driver drive the train from the engine one way and from the front coach going the other way. The front coach would have the controls for the engine's regulator, brakes and whistles connected to it through several rotating shafts and linkages, meaning the driver had full control of the locomotive while standing in the front of the coach. Meanwhile, the fireman stayed in the engine checking its valves and gauges. The guard, driver and fireman all communicated through a series of electric bells rigged up between the engine, guard's compartment and the coach's driving compartment. If more than one coach was needed on a train, the engine would often stay in the middle of the coaches, as drivers found there would be some play between the linkages if two coaches were connected in a row instead of directly to the engine. The design worked well for push-pull services, but the GWR was concerned that the sight of a steam engine in between two coaches would look jarring to some passengers. So in 1906, some engines had housings built over them to make them blend in with the coaches. Coaling and filling the water tanks of these engines was much more difficult, and after about 5 years, the GWR figured out that the passengers didn't really care about the appearance of a locomotive in the middle of the train, and so they removed the casings from the engines. The auto coach was essentially one of the first examples of a modern, double-ended, multiple-unit train, with no shunting of coaches needed. The coaches also worked with a large range of their tank engines, ranging from their panniers, prairies, and most commonly their 042-1400 class locomotives. The coaches were used right up until 1964, long after nationalisation, with the design receiving only some minor improvements and adjustments over the years, showing once again the Great Western Railway may have just been a little ahead of its time. Not everyone is perfect. Where at some things people exceed, others struggle. For many people, however, all they need is a helping hand in order to keep up with the crowd. And when it comes to railways, trains are not so different, as some of British Rail's early diesels pointed out. During the 1960s, diesel locomotive power was steadily replacing steam on British railways. Naturally, this came with some teething troubles, but for the most part, the diesels proved to be just as reliable as steam when it came to getting work done. There was, however, one aspect of operation where diesels often fell short compared to steam engines: braking. Steam engines were not only much heavier on average than diesels, but could also rely on their tenders to provide extra braking when needed. Diesels, on the other hand, were lighter, had much smaller wheels and fewer of them to brake with compared to a standard 8-wheeled steam freight engine. This didn't matter too much when it came to passenger services or fitted goods trains, as the trucks and carriages were equipped with air brakes. However, British Railways was still in possession of a significant amount of goods wagons that didn't have air brakes fitted, meaning the only braking power the trains had was the engine at the front and the guard's van at the back. track. Naturally, poor braking on goods trains became a concern, especially on lines with steep grades, and so BR began looking for a solution. Eventually, someone figured that if tenders provided steam locomotives with better braking power, then why not give diesels tenders too? In 1960, 3 tenders were built in Glasgow to test this idea, these being made out of short metal frames mounted on 2 four-wheeled bogies which were equipped with air brakes. These tenders would be connected to the diesel pulling the train, and should the driver need extra brakes, they could apply the air brake on the tender, giving them a few extra tons of stopping power. The idea worked, and British Railways immediately put in an order for 119 more of these brake tenders from various works across the country. Rather than build them from scratch, most of the tenders were built out of old carriages. The frames would be modified to size, while the bogies they rolled on were taken from old LMS and LNER carriages that were being withdrawn, these being fitted with air braking equipment already, saving the need to spend time or money fitting them. The bodies were hollow and would be filled with scrap metal or poured concrete to provide them with the extra weight needed to brake effectively. To help make them more compatible with diesel engines, both practically and aesthetically, the tenders had a very low profile, allowing drivers to see over them. They were fitted with lamp brackets so the train's headcode discs could be displayed at the front of the train, and their bodies were streamlined and painted the same shade of green with yellow at the front as the diesels, with the green later being swapped for blue when British Rail introduced their Rail Blue livery. The tenders each weighed 35.5 tons. However, for some reason, the 10 built at Stratford were not only 2 tons heavier, but also built to look like the prototypes with angular, plain metal bodies. By 1965, all 122 were in service. Despite initially being built for use on the heavy grades in the northeast of England, the tenders eventually found themselves all over the country on unfitted freight trains, even getting as far as the southern region of the railway network. On heavier trains, it wasn't uncommon to see an engine with 2 tenders, usually with one in front of the engine and another one behind it. Where the tender was positioned seemed to be region-specific, as in the north, if only one tender was needed, it was often at the front being pushed by the engine, while in the south, drivers preferred to pull them instead. Why this difference in positioning, I'm not too sure. On numerous occasions, drivers with a tender in front of them would stop at signals set to danger, only for the tender to be slightly past the signal and compromise the block ahead. On top of that, engines with a tender were limited to 60 miles an hour while being pulled, and 45 miles an hour when being pushed, making them unideal for fast freight work. Despite their limitations, these tenders were a massive boon for many diesel engines, allowing them to handle unfitted freight wagons much easier, becoming a unique but not infrequent sight along the British Railway network. Their usefulness, however, wouldn't last forever. By the late 1970s, British Rail had upgraded or replaced most wagons that weren't fitted with air brakes, meaning the tenders now no longer served a use. They were slowly withdrawn from service throughout the 1980s and scrapped at various yards. The final 2 ended up at Barry Island Scrapyard in Wales, however, even these were cut up, with none of the 122 tenders being saved or preserved. Fortunately, years later in 2017, a brand new brake tender was built using parts of an old Mark I British Railways coach and can be seen at the Great Central Railway in Leicestershire. While not exactly the most groundbreaking or significant piece of rolling stock to ever run on British rails, the brake tenders still played a big part in helping early diesels handle heavy goods that they otherwise would have struggled with. Just goes to show that even the most modern and seemingly up-to-date folks need a little help sometimes, and that no matter how small the deed, you'll always be remembered when you help others. For many people, trains on their own are a fascinating spectacle. Several hundred tons of metal thundering along at high speeds can bring out the child in all of us. You know what else brings out the child in all of us? The circus. But does it make sense to combine the two? Surprisingly, yes. By 1872, P.T. Barnum's Great Travelling Museum, Menagerie, Caravan and Hippodrome, later shortened to the P.T. Barnum Circus, was struggling to get around. The circus had acquired so many acts and assets it was becoming difficult to tour the US. The show mostly travelled by road, but occasionally paid local railroads to transport various, heavier assets short distances. However, the circus had grown so much that the managers decided that they would only perform at large venues, and due to the amount of equipment, animals, performers and staff they had, they felt the only way to effectively transport them all was by train. Railroads at the time connected every major city in the US, could haul large amounts of heavy goods, and were one of the fastest ways of getting from A to B, so it was the perfect way for the circus to travel. Flat cars were purchased from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and managers William Cameron Koo and Dan Costello developed a system of ropes, pulleys and ramps to help load and unload the cars. Halfway through its first season of its rail haul tour, it was found the stock purchased from the Pennsylvania was in very poor condition and proving to be hazardous, leading the managers to order 60 brand new cars for the circus. This included carriages for transporting performers and staff, livestock cars for transporting the animals tailored to the needs of said animals, and boxcars and flatbeds for transporting various supplies, wagons and the tents. The only thing the circus didn't own was a locomotive, relying on the railroads they travelled on to provide an engine to tow their train. After becoming the Barnum and Bailey Circus, in 1897, it was decided the show would go on tour in Europe. The problem was the American-built rolling stock was too big for European railways, and so a fleet of custom cars had to be built for the 5-year tour. 67 cars were ordered and built by the Phoenix Works of Stoke-on-Trent in England. The main circus train was made up of 66 cars, 7 sleeping cars for performers and staff, a saloon car for Mr. Bailey, the manager, 3 elephant cars, 1 camel car, a lead stock car, a double-decker car, 16 stock cars, 35 flatbeds and 1 baggage car. Some of the cars, such as the elephant car, had to be fitted with smaller wheels to help keep the floor lower to the ground in order to make enough space for the animals. A special advertising car was built and attached to various local trains. This car was equipped with a small office and the facilities required to make paste for putting up posters, running a few weeks ahead of the circus to spread word of its arrival. Despite being built in England, these cars were designed to be American in appearance to fit with the American nature of the show. Barnum and Bailey arrived in England in May 1898, but the last car wasn't completed until that July. Just like in America, the circus relied on the railways to supply the engines that would transport them. The circus had to be split up into 3 separate trains during transport, with each being pulled by 2 goods engines. Once the train was fully assembled, the circus toured Britain for 2 seasons before being shipped to Germany in 1900, where it went on to tour Austria, Hungary, Croatia, modern-day Czech Republic, modern-day Poland, Holland, Belgium, France and Switzerland before finally returning to New York in 1902. The British circus cars were left behind, with 50 being reused by Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show between 1903 and 1906 during their European tour. Afterwards, most of the cars were scrapped, with a handful ending up transporting miners at the Chatterley-Whitfield Colliery. Only 1 sleeper car remains, currently preserved at the National Museum in Cardiff. The Ringling Brothers Circus also ended up investing in their own railroad rolling stock, and so when they bought out the Barnum and Bailey Circus, they had more equipment than they knew what to do with. The newly formed Ringling Bros and Barnum and Bailey Circus eventually split its show into 2, forming the Red Tour and the Blue Tour. Both tours travelled for 2 years at a time, with the Red Tours starting on odd-numbered years and the Blue Tours starting on even-numbered years. The Ringling Bros and Barnum and Bailey weren't the only travelling circuses to have their own private trains either. Other names include the Walter L. Main Circus, the Greater Norris and Roe Show, the Colbros Circus, the Hagenbeck Wallace Trained Wild Animal Circus, and many, many more. Countries outside of the US also used circus trains too, with many menageries and travelling shows taking to the rails when going on tour. Even to this day, shows like Circus Krone and Circus Roncalli travel from place to place by train, as it's still the best way of getting such a large amount of people and equipment from A to B all together. All that being said, a life on the road is never an easy one, and circus trains were no different. Sleeping quarters were provided for both staff and performers, but they were often far from comfortable. The bigger stars of the show had relatively cozy compartments, sometimes having a third or even half a carriage to themselves. Meanwhile, many of the workers and staff slept in crowded bunks with little space or privacy, some even having to share beds. The lack of ventilation in the cars meant it could get very stuffy very quickly, resulting in some people finding it more comfortable to sleep in the equipment cars instead. It also wasn't a guarantee that the circus would feed its troupe either, as many companies simply told workers to sort themselves out. Other trains did carry dining cars to feed their troops on long trips, but the meals weren't always free. The Ringling Brothers Circus were recorded in the 1990s charging staff $10 a week to live on their train, plus extra for food. Trainers often slept with or in cars close to their animals, as some animals tended to become quite anxious during train journeys. The animal cars were often positioned at the front of the train to provide them with a much smoother ride, but this was still little comfort. Elephants in particular seemed to suffer the most, as their large size left them quite cramped in their boxcars, not to mention how they were often chained to keep them from moving too much. In some cases, the elephants even found themselves being used to load, unload and shunt around some of the cars the circus used. Many modern circuses have retired elephants from their shows and stopped using them to help load wagons long ago, but the treatment of many other animals is still a point of contention for animal rights activists. There have also been a large number of accidents involving circus trains, from simple derailments to full-on fatal collisions. The most recent incident involving the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus train derailing in Florida in 1994. This was mostly due to circuses using older rolling stock that was worn out, poorly maintained, or simply outdated. In the case of the Hammond Circus wreck of 1918, the cars used were very outdated, being built out of wood and lit with oil lamps, proving to be a fatal combination. In recent years, living conditions on circus trains have significantly improved, with the Ringling Brothers train having running water and electricity in every carriage, easier access to animals while on the move for trainers, better ventilation and heating for both crew and animals. The trains were limited to 60 miles an hour and provided with dedicated train masters to ensure everyone's safety, and better drains and flooring in the animal cars to improve hygiene and to make them easier to clean. Despite all this, most sleeping quarters were still cramped, regardless of the modern comforts. In recent years, circuses have lost the massive draw they once had, and one by one, both circuses and circus trains have begun to disappear, with the Ringling Brothers closing their show in 2017, selling off any train cars they could and scrapping any left over. The Greatest Show on Earth returned in 2023, though this time they decided to do away with the train and mostly use road and air to transport their equipment and crew. Fortunately, circus trains haven't disappeared completely. As I said earlier, German groups Circus Krone and Circus Roncalli both rely on railways to get around, with several other circus companies around the world still using private trains of their own, so they'll still be around for a while yet. But all the same, let us remember the circus trains not only as an iconic piece of railway history, but also for the magical feeling felt by many when an old steamer rolled into town with colourful car after car reading, "The Greatest Show on Earth." In the old days of railways, there were many important roles that needed doing in order to keep things working smoothly, from shunting to signalling to scheduling. These duties were performed by many different people and pieces of specialised equipment, including, but not limited to, toads. As railways began to take on more and more traffic in the mid-1800s, concerns were raised over the safe running of both goods and passenger services. Since trains had no form of automatic or continuous braking, regulations were put in place requiring all goods trains to have a guard van be positioned at the rear. These vans were specially designed to assist in braking heavy trains and prevent wagons from running away should a coupling snap. Initially, many of these vans were made out of modified goods wagons, but as time went on, railways began to design and build them from scratch specifically for braking, with later guards vans also serving as mobile offices where guards could organise timesheets and handle any relevant paperwork to do with the goods on board. Each railway had their own designs, with most generally following the pattern of a box van with a small veranda at each end. The Great Western Railway, however, differed in their design, instead having a single, larger veranda at one end where the braking equipment was located. This at first was a simple open-air platform, but the design was soon changed to have a roof covering the exposed part to give the guards some protection. Though this arrangement became common across the Great Western Railway, it wouldn't be until 1894 that a proper, standardised brake van design was developed following a similar layout to its predecessors, with a large open veranda at one end. To assist with braking, the vans had large blocks of concrete or scrap metal set between their frames to increase their weight, as well as being fitted with sanding gear to help the wheels grip the rails should they be wet or oily. Windows were fitted in both the front and rear ends of the van so the guard could keep an eye on the train from within the van itself, with a full-size door allowing access from the inside of the van to the veranda. On the opposite side of the van, a hatch was installed that allowed guards to access the lamp bracket for when the van was running veranda first. A seat was fitted to give the guards somewhere to sit while operating the brakes outside, and the inside of the van was made comfortable too, featuring a desk, cupboards, seating, a stove and toolboxes filled with important equipment such as tail and side lamps, spare couplings, shunter's pole, oil, brake sticks, wheel sprags and anything else that might be needed to keep a train moving in a pinch. Later additions included lighting in the form of both oil lanterns and electric lights, and a first aid kit that the guards were trained to use. As well as guards, many vans included features designed to make life easier for other railway workers, such as footboards and handrails mounted lower down on the outsides of the vans for yard workers and guards to hold onto while shunting. The verandas of vans used on track maintenance trains were closed off to make the van interiors much more spacious, and were fitted with more seats, mess accommodation, and extra tool storage for track workers. Other variations included the vans that were enclosed so that they could work in the Severn Tunnel, and the ones fitted with side doors allowing them to be partially used as goods vans. But the thing that made the Great Western's brake vans stand out from the others wasn't their appearance or versatility, but their names. In 1852, the Great Western Railway began using telegraph communication much more as a safety measure for regulating trains and allowing stations to communicate to each other. In order to make communication more efficient, all the different wagon types were given different codes, such as mink for covered goods vans, beaver for flat trucks, and cricket for composite carriages, just to name a few. As you can probably tell, many of the initial code words were derived from animals to help differentiate them from destination names and other orders that came with the message. To help identify these wagons, their code names were stenciled onto them, which brings us to the brake vans. Out of all of the animals, these were given the code name of Toad. Whether this code was assigned at random like many of the other animal code names were, or was someone's attempt at making a joke about how these vans would be towed along behind a train, we'll never truly know. But regardless of the reason, the code of Toad was assigned to the brake vans. Over time, the name Toad became more and more synonymous with the brake vans, until eventually that became their go-to name for railway workers and enthusiasts alike, no matter the size, weight or layout. Something that likely helped cement this name was the Great Western's practice of allocating toads to a specific line, allowing guards to build up experience on that route while also making them a familiar sight for train spotters. This, combined with their unusual shape, name and general enthusiasm many had for the Great Western, is likely what made them such a fond and well-known aspect of the railway. Enthusiasm and a funny name, however, only go so far, as the Toads had their own fair share of shortcomings, primarily their veranda. The braking equipment in many other contemporary vans was positioned inside the guards compartment, allowing them to control the brakes while remaining sheltered. On the Toads, however, the handle was mounted outside on the veranda, and while this did give guards an excellent view of the train regardless of the direction the van was facing, it still meant they were still mostly exposed to the elements, especially when travelling veranda forwards. The way they were facing was another issue. The preferred arrangement was for the veranda to be positioned at the very back, as it not only provided the guard with easier access to the lamp brackets, but also helped reduce draft and stop smoke, soot and sparks from the engine getting in. Because of this, it was common for Toads to be turned around before being attached to longer distance goods trains, something that was a waste of time compared to other double-ended brake van designs that didn't need to be turned around. And despite being spacious compared to most other contemporary brake vans, the Toads were considerably less safe. The Toads only had one door to get in and out of the guard's compartment, and should an accident occur that would block the door, the guard would be trapped inside. The hatch at the other end was about big enough for a person to fit through, but having to climb up and squeeze out of a raised hatch in an emergency situation wasn't ideal, especially when other vans had a door at the front and back and plenty of room to jump clear. Nonetheless, the Toads remained as the Great Western's standard brake van design all the way until nationalisation, when they were removed from certain workings over safety concerns. Despite the Great Western's telegraph codes being phased out in 1943 in favour of a standardised system for all railways, the name Toad stuck and has since become the official term for these Western brake vans. Their charm could only keep them around for so long, however, as by the 1960s, trains fitted with continuous brakes became more and more common, and newer diesels usually had a second cab that the guard could ride in, making brake vans pretty much obsolete. This, however, wasn't the end of the line for the Toads, as their size and safety made them ideal for use on industrial railways as small carriages for transporting workers. They also allowed for developing heritage railways to offer ride-on experiences for passengers and tourists. Because of this, they became quite a popular item among preservationists, and as a result, roughly 21 Toads have been preserved. Though maybe not the most practical of all of Britain's brake vans, the Great Western's Toads were still a staple and remained a favourite among enthusiasts. They might not have everyone hopping with excitement, but in the small pond of preserved British rolling stock, they certainly stand out among the rest. Just don't expect them to croak anytime soon. Railways have always needed specialised wagons for transporting special cargo, be it livestock, cars, or nobility. At the turn of the 20th century, however, the railways of Britain had a new kind of delicate cargo that required a lot of care and attention, a cargo that became a significant logistical challenge to handle properly. Bananas. Because of the specific climate that's required to grow them, bananas were very difficult to get in Britain. In order to get to Europe from plantations in the southern hemisphere, bananas would have to be loaded onto boats and spend weeks at sea. However, once picked, they tend to ripen quite quickly, and so by the time the fruit arrived in Europe, it would be very close to expiring. In 1901, however, this changed with the formation of Elders and Fifes, who began running banana boats to and from England. These boats were fitted with large refrigeration units, which prevented the bananas from ripening during the voyage. Once they were delivered to their final destination, they'd be stored in ripening sheds which warmed them up, causing them to quickly become ripe and ready to go to market. Because bananas bruise easily, however, the railways quickly found that they couldn't simply load them into covered vans as they would with other domestic fruits. Instead, precautions had to be taken to not only sufficiently cushion the bananas during transit, but also keep the temperature in the vans low to keep them from ripening before being delivered. This led to the development of wagons dedicated entirely to transporting bananas, with the first example possibly coming from the Midland Railway. 225 8-ton banana vans were ordered from Derby Works in 1905, these essentially being standard Midland vans fitted with insulation, vents, vacuum brakes, and cupboard doors instead of the usual sliding doors. These vans were most often seen around Avonmouth docks, which became one of the largest ports for banana traffic in Britain, with the ports in Hull, Southampton, and Garston also handling a significant amount of bananas. As a result of this increase in banana traffic, other companies too also began building their own dedicated banana vans, including the London South Western Railway and the London North Western Railway. The Great Eastern Railway did use banana vans, but usually hired them from another company. The outbreak of the First World War saw a significant decrease in banana traffic, and many banana vans found themselves put to one side. After the war, however, banana traffic increased dramatically, resulting in the railways requiring more vans to handle the deliveries. In 1918, the Great Western Railway had 300 general-purpose vans modified for use as meat vans, fitting them with insulation and closing off their air vents. This was only meant to be a temporary measure, but in 1921, when banana traffic took off, it was decided that 258 of these vans would be modified into banana vans, being fitted with vacuum brakes and having new adjustable vents fitted at each end. On top of that, these vans were also fitted with steam heating. A through pipe ran under the van and connected to an uptake which connected to two larger heating pipes in the ceiling. Drip trays were fitted to prevent condensation, and the temperature inside could be controlled by a valve on the outside of the van. The steam used for heating would come from the locomotive pulling the vans just like with passenger carriages, but the process of actually warming the vans up took time. Once the engine was connected, workers had to wait for steam to reach the rear van before turning the heating on, starting from the back and making their way forward. The vents and heating allowed the vans to maintain a constant temperature of 11 degrees Celsius all year round, keeping the bananas from ripening before reaching their destination. By turning the temperature up, the railways could also start the ripening process as the bananas were in transit, saving the need to store them in a ripening shed. After the grouping in 1923, the LMS designed and built banana vans of their own in 1924, these also being fitted with vents and steam heating. Both the LMS and Great Western vans were primarily loaded at Avonmouth docks, where vans would be pulled through the loading sheds via ropes and capstans and loaded as they moved. The door handles on both the LMS and Great Western vans were mounted lower down in order to make them more accessible to workers on ground level, and the operation was so big that there were 2 rail yards on site, one for each company. Fresh straw would be placed on the floor of the vans before the bananas were loaded in. Once the bananas were delivered, the straw would be removed from the vans and burnt to help ensure that no tropical insects or spiders had been brought over on accident. The Great Eastern Railway put in an order for 100 banana vans in 1923, and these quickly came under the ownership of the London North Eastern Railway. Many of these vans ended up migrating to Southern Railways, however, in the 1930s, when Elders and Fifes moved handling operations from Hull to Southampton docks. The old London South Western banana vans had been satisfactory until that point, but the influx of bananas meant the Southern had to build 200 more vans to meet demand, with another 125 standard vans being modified for use when Elders and Fifes began unloading at the Royal Albert Docks in 1935. As far as I'm aware, the Great Western Railway was the first railway recorded using steam heating in their banana vans. Most sources broadly refer to all banana vans in the country having steam heating, and while that's true of post-grouping stock, information on the vans pre-grouping is limited and vague. Though many railways had built banana vans prior to the Great Western, I couldn't find anything confirming any company had used steam heating prior to 1921. Banana traffic became a surprisingly big operation for the railways, but the Second World War soon caused it to take a significant hit. Banana imports were essentially halted during the war, with most vans either being put to one side or repurposed. The Great Western Railway temporarily converted some of their banana vans back into meat vans, and many of the old wagons belonging to the Midland Railway ended up as departmental stock or tool vans. After the war, the flow of bananas picked up again, with British Railways building their own banana vans. These didn't have steam heating, being more heavily insulated instead, but did possess through pipes so they could work with heated vans. All banana vans eventually had their heating equipment removed by 1963. By the end of the 60s, roads were taking much of the banana traffic away from the railways, and gradually more and more vans were phased out of BR's roster until 1979 when the final banana service ran. A handful of these vans have since been preserved and are on display at various museums and heritage railways up and down the country. The many banana vans of Britain's railways, then, are an unusual but interesting product of their time, standing out as a prime example of the incredible complex logistics that the railways had to handle. So next time you tuck into a banana, be it slicing it into your breakfast or making banoffee pie, just remember it took an awful lot of problem solving to get it there. Subscribe for more.